from a few different, some very personal experiences and some more general thoughts. I think I started with something very simple, which is that there was a moment when I moved from living in London to living in Amsterdam, and I started a new relationship with a new family and a new job. And I was driving back through London, because I still worked a lot in London, and I drove past my old apartment, and I suddenly realised, well, actually it would be interesting to see myself still coming out of that apartment, living my old life, and that would actually be rather easy. London is so big, you could be living two lives and you would never bump into each other. That made me start to think about how common it is to live life in chapters now, and that's a very new experience. That we sort of have periods in our lives where we reinvent ourselves and we go and live in new places, or we start new relationships, and that's become so much more normal than it was maybe 50 years ago. And then I started thinking about how that's also expressed in the kind of contemporary obsession with our digital identities, and how we all feel we should have some presence online, and which tends to be our better selves in some way, that we present our better selves out to the world through Facebook and Twitter, and that it's become a kind of civic duty to become the best person that we can. That's almost in some ways replaced a kind of religion, that we feel that fulfilling ourselves is the new right, let's say. And so I guess those things all came together, and then I just became, and then I think the thing that sort of pulled it into a story was the feeling of, it would be interesting just to make a film about someone who went on a journey where it became clear they would have to kill someone, and that person would finally turn out to be themselves. I was interested in this very ancient idea that you sort of have to kill yourself sort of spiritually to reinvent yourself, but also how all those very ancient ideas have become quite abused, if you like, now. So yeah, it was a cluster of things, but I think there was a moment where it became a story.
Speaking about science fiction, which are the movies you like the most that inspired you?
I think that I think of course I'm very inspired by the obvious kind of great. So something, it's hard to avoid Blade Runner, it's hard to avoid Ridley Scott, it's hard to avoid Tarkovsky, it's hard to avoid Kubrick. I think more specifically I was very interested in a John Frankenheimer movie called Seconds, in which made in the sort of early 60s, and in which a sort of bored middle-aged man gets in contact with an organisation that transforms him, and he sort of wakes up and finds that he's Rock Hudson. He's handsome and muscular, and then he doesn't really want to live that life. It's about what a terrible nightmare that turns into, and it's a very 60s movie, really, because it's really about youth culture. I mean, it's really about that moment in the 60s where your duty in life was no longer to sort of be an adult, but was actually to be sort of young and hip and new forever. So I didn't want to remake that movie, but it felt to me like that was a 60s version of things I was interested in. And I tried to make a film which was about our new anxieties, which is much more that we become really multiple, and actually those multiples are quite out of control. We don't really know anymore which of our many identities that we grow and kind of foster are really us. So that was a very specific sort of science fiction reference, and I think consistently I'm heavily sort of big admirer of and very influenced by William Gibson as a writer, and actually the next project I'm making is based on a William Gibson short story, and I'm interested in the way that Gibson's well, he talks about, I'm not interested in technology, I'm interested in what technology does to people. So he's someone who has talked a lot about how science fiction's a new form of philosophical or humanist literature, really, that's just paying attention to the strangeness of the world, which I think is important to me. Like how to make a realist film that is really about how we live now. You know, I think there's a big tradition in England of social realism, but often that's actually depicting a society that's sort of started disappearing 40 years ago. You know, it's always the same class stories, and there's always a sort of, you know, underclass character, and it's very hard to be socially mobile, and those people are always really trapped. Those movies have been made since the 50s, 1950s, you know. It's not really quite so true anymore. There's a lot of other things going on which are much more about hypermobility and rootlessness, and those are harder to talk about, I think, and those are things I guess I'm interested in.
What about the noir vocation of this movie? Yesterday you talked about you think about this movie not just as a sci-fi but also as a noir.
I think someone said something quite interesting about science fiction, is that it's not a genre. It's that every science fiction movie is also something else. You know, like an Alien movie is a science fiction horror film. Blade Runner is a science fiction noir film. So there's a way in which the setting and what you can say about society for me is science fiction. But I was interested in I guess it's a sort of romantic end of noir. You know, I mean, the film tries to sort of, you know, tip its hat to Vertigo, I guess, in a very simple way, in that it's about an elusive woman, and there's a moment at which she literally goes from being dark-haired to blonde, you know, which is a classic sort of Vertigo moment. And I think there's a sort of line of remakes of Vertigo that no one's really talked about as a you know, I remember when Lost Highway came out, people were quite puzzled by that film. I was like, well, it's a remake of Vertigo, surely. I mean, it's there's a number of films, I think, which go back to that theme, and I think the noir as a genre adds sort of psychological intensity, and is a really, maybe it does for emotions what science fiction does for society. It's like a very heightened version of, you know, you can talk about families and emotions in noir in the way that you can talk about society in science fiction. You sort of exaggerate it and it becomes really intense. So that's interesting.
That's why maybe I found some De Palma vibes in the movie.
That's really interesting. We talked actually a lot about De Palma when we were shooting the film. And I think, you know, as a filmmaker, my first love was sort of 70s Hollywood movies. So that's where my heart is. And then my second love was sort of, I guess, you know, high European art cinema, Alain Resnais, Last Year in Marienbad. So, and it felt like that would be interesting to think about how those go cross, how those can cross, because they're closer than I think people realise. And De Palma especially has some extraordinary things to say about jumps in identity, and visually we were definitely very aware of 70s cinema in particular, and De Palma particularly. So.
Thank you.
Nadia is able to move away to forget her past, while Slater is always linked to the past. This is something specific of these characters, or this is a sort of vision, a male point of view about relationship?
I think I didn't see it as a gender-based thing, really. I was more interested in these different strategies that you can have for going through a multiple life, and I think there's a sort of small exchange towards the end of the film that for me is important, which is when when Slater finally meets the blonde Nadia, she's the first Nadia that knows about the other Nadias. And that, for me, means that she is kind of a match for his knowledge, like his obsession. He has the burden of knowing about his other versions and his other life. And I think, say, for example, the middle Nadia is kind of, for me, an innocent. She doesn't want to know about any complications. But the last Nadia, she says, you know, when he asks how the other Nadia's doing, what about the other Nadias, she says, well, it's not really my concern, they're less developed people than we are. And so she sort of knows about them, but she's not responsible for them. And I guess maybe that's what we have to, I feel as people we have to become. The more of our different selves we know, the more we know about ourselves, the better. So there's a way in which I would say the three Nadias know different amounts about themselves. And Slater is sort of, I hope he's sort of, you feel he's kind of dragged to know more about himself. I mean, he's quite unwilling in the way he's dragged through, you know, he doesn't really want to go on this. So at the end of the film, for me, she is someone who knows about her other selves, and he is forced to kill one of his other selves, which in a funny way means he also becomes that other self, you know, because it's the really moment in the film where he's violent too. Until then, he's rather an innocent, you know. He's surprised by the guns, and he's. So I think there's a loss of innocence in the last two. And some people have said, oh, that's depressing, but for me that's not depressing. It's life.
I read that you worked with Johnny Greenwood for a documentary.
I did, yeah.
How was the collaboration, and how much important is music in your works, John?
That film was a documentary film using all archive footage, and it was sort of basically told it was like a life cycle of a single life going from birth to death, but it was the moment of kind of 100 years of cinema, so it used footage from the whole kind of 100 years of cinema. And it was actually the first soundtrack that Johnny did. And we were talking to quite a lot of people about the film, but Radiohead were sort of top of my list, really. I felt that they had this mixture of kind of intensity and pop culture and intellect, which I found really fascinating. And Johnny was really wanted to do the project. So we started working, and we agreed. It was a really fascinating collaboration, and it was very. We sent each other very early versions of everything. So once we'd cut very rough sections of the film, I would send that to him, and he would write music, or he would send me a very rough mix, and we would cut to that. So it was because it was made about 2002, that film, and it was just the moment in a way when it was very easy to edit and work digitally in a very flexible way, and so the film benefited from this ability to keep sending each other very loose, rough sketches. You could suddenly sketch with moving images and sketch, and he could send me music, and you could send them by email, and it went really fast. So yeah, it was a fantastic collaboration, and music is really important to me, and I think then the next two films I worked with a young Catalan composer called Roger Bula, who is a very much more classical film composer and very kind of lyrical. And I think for each film, sort of casting the music is very important. So I think for this film, I really wanted someone who was interested in very classical, romantic film scoring. We really listened a lot to Burn Cairn music and talked a lot about that very fully orchestrated classical approach to film music. So I think for different films it's very different, but say for this next film, the Gibson film, I think that might have a very different approach to music again. So I started, when I first made films I was an animator. I made a lot of animated films for television in the UK for Channel 4. Quite abstract visual films, and there you realise that the sort of how much the music changes an image when it sort of floods an image. So yeah, I guess I carry that with me still.
For this film, you had to use a lot of visual effects.
Yeah.
I guess it was very difficult, and maybe I guess you needed a big budget for that.
The film is not a huge budget, actually. No, it's really a sort of modest European scale film. But I come out of a visual effects background, as I said, as an animator, so it's an area that I think about a lot and know about. And we tried to put together, I guess in a way, trying to build a new approach for making European films, in that it's shot in a very particular way, and that's to do with also being able to shoot handheld and actually steady everything and change and steady the framing afterwards. So, you know, it was shot in 25 days, which is not so much. And then the visual effects team was only 5 people, which is really tiny. So it's trying to build a way of making sort of artisan films, but that enable you to make films that are part of that larger cinema. You know, like if you want to start talking about referring to 70s Hollywood movies, then in a way you've also got to make it look like a movie, if you understand me. And so I'm very interested in that sort of ability to, with new tools and the smaller scale tools, to actually make films that have that kind of classically cinematic scope, but on a more modest European scale in terms of how they actually work, how the work is done. You know, one side of that is it takes longer, so it was in post-production for a year because it takes that long to, if you're only having a small team, it just takes longer to build. Yeah.
Here?
It was a year in post-production. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.